So welcome to the ACFID webinar on code reporting. Today we are looking at how one could go about completing your second code self-assessment and looking at what's new in the code since your last CSA. So we have about 60 people registered for this webinar, which is fantastic engagement. Thank you for your interest. So the primary purpose of today's webinar is to help you with your efficiencies in reporting, as well as supporting your understanding of the code, the assessment process, and how to get the best out of it. Secondary to the purpose of the webinar is to provide you with an overview of membership compliance, to give you an understanding of trends that we are seeing, where our membership shines, and what are some of the challenges and areas that we have identified as further needing some work. So who are we? Well, my colleague Emily is in the picture. She has actually needed to run out and couldn't attend today's webinar. So, and then Paul Brunton circled, and myself. We are the three of us are Codies, and Paul is on the webinar and will be co-presenting with me today. This pic is about 3 years old, so it's not an accurate current reflection of all of the ACFID staff, and it was clearly taken in the days before COVID existed. But we just wanted to let you know who we were. We are running the webinar in different locations today, meaning we are all in lockdown, probably alongside many of you, and we're working from our various homes in Canberra. So we may be interrupted by pets, children, or tradespeople. But it is also a great time to acknowledge that we are on Ngunnawal country. So the name Canberra is thought to have derived from a local Aboriginal word for meeting place. We would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we work. We pay our respects to the First Nations people of this country. At ACFID, we support the Uluru Statement from the Heart, which calls for enshrining a First Nations voice in the Australian Constitution. I'd also like to add that the ACFID Secretariat is on our reconciliation journey, and we are developing a reconciliation action plan, or RAP, which is designed to assist us to develop deeper and respectful relationships and create meaningful opportunities with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. So as part of this, we would encourage you, if you feel comfortable, to acknowledge the country on which you're sitting in the chat box. A note on housekeeping. So we encourage questions. This is the time to comment and throw us any niggly questions you may have. No question is a silly one, and I think the best way to do that is pop them in the chat box at any time during the webinar. If we're clever, we might get the question and answer it at the time, or if we're less clever, we will collate them all and talk to them at the end. Also, obviously, for audio visual, if you could keep your mics on mute. And also it's being live captioned. They're available on the link that's shared in the chat box. And the presentation is going to be recorded, or is currently being recorded, so that we can host this on our ACFID YouTube channel for people who may have missed it. Agenda. So if we break today's webinar up into 3 parts. So the first will be a zooming out picture, a bird's eye view of compliance. So an overview of members' compliance to date. We'll look at the focus areas and the policies, what we are currently seeing, and we might talk about, just very briefly, complaints that are made to the Code of Conduct Committee. A zooming in, chapter 2, the nitty gritty. So we'll give you a quick refresher on code reporting, identify 5 things to consider when preparing your second CSA, and give you a practical example of what works and what doesn't. And thirdly, the question and answers. We've got some proactive questions that we'd like to, and we'll answer them for you, as well as listening to any that you may pop in the chat box as the webinar goes along. I'd like to also comment that today's webinar has an assumption of some knowledge of the code, so it's not intended for anyone who's totally new to the code. So we will talk in a way that assumes that you have some kind of overview of code reporting. And we might also pop around some acronyms by accident, because we love acronyms in our sector. So PSEAH is Prevention of Sexual Exploitation and Abuse. PSEAH is Prevention of Sexual Exploitation, Abuse and Harassment. ANCP, Australian NGO Cooperation Program, and FYE, Financial Year End, etc. So let's start with a picture of how we're going to go. Let's start with a picture of compliance across the membership. But before we dive in, we need to high five you, dude. We need to thank you. So for those of you who have been members with ACFID since 2017 or before, we acknowledge the substantial work you've done in travelling from the old code to the new code or the current code. We are at a point in time which is quite significant because all our members have now completed a CSA for the first time, and all of those CSAs have been assessed. So all our members now understand how they're fared and where they need to improve. So the hard yards have been done. So we'd just like to acknowledge that you've all worked hard in understanding what the current code asks for. You've all strengthened your policies and practices, and you've submitted some really solid reporting to reflect this. We'd like to also highlight that the code is a benchmark of good practice. It does not represent the bare minimum, or it is not a low, and it's not a low benchmark. Given this achievement, we do expect you to benefit in future years. So every CSA should not feel like that same benchmark. Rather, it should be a chance to reflect and reconfirm what you already have in place, rather than developing a continual raft of new policies, processes, and reporting commentary. So we just wanted to ensure that you took a moment to pat yourselves on the back for the journey travelled so far. So some key takeaways. This is what we know. We know that overall compliance with the code remains really high. Most of you have most of the code covered, and resubmissions are often due to some of the more detailed requirements of the code and providing missing bits of evidence or commentary that show you are complying with the code. We also know that the most valuable engagement that our membership has with the code continues to be through your code self-assessment. We do also acknowledge that the CSA is time-consuming and it does take resources. Our approach is to give you feedback that is specific to you, with the aim that this will strengthen your processes and practice. So once these are in place, compliance with the code should be easier in the future. We have listened and we understand loud and clear that the cost of compliance is significant. And we do try and balance this with the other feedback that we do receive about the code self-assessment process. That being that the CSA assessment time is also a really valuable process of quality assurance for our members. So now that all our members have completed a CSA, you are in a really strong position to maintain that high level of compliance with the code, even amidst significant external pressures. Compliance with the code leads to a strong sector, and we hope it provides a point of difference in a competitive funding environment. So despite the high rates of compliance across the code, there are still few areas that members are consistently being asked to resubmit. Now, this doesn't mean necessarily that organisations are not compliant with these areas of the code, but it does mean that maybe not enough information was provided in that initial CSA, or there were updates that were required. We wanted to draw these to your attention so that you can review your own CSA before submitting it and reduce the likelihood of having to go through a resubmission process. So the areas of the code with the highest rates of resubmission included organisational accountability. And by that, I'm talking about 7.3 in the code, which covers complaints handling, transparency policies, and information on websites. 4.2, undertaking a contextual analysis. 6.2, ethical collection of and use of images. 8.2, financial wrongdoing policies. And 9.4, organisational codes of conduct. So these closely align to areas of the code that have new PSEAH requirements or have been given greater scrutiny as part of the CCC focus area. Speaking of focus areas, one of the documents required to be uploaded in your CSA is the policy or guidance or statement that you have that commits your organisation to the inclusion of people with disabilities. So far, of the 30 or so policies we have assessed, about 10% have been asked to resubmit in one or more of the indicators in 2.4. So We suggest reviewing your existing policies and looking for the policy guidance that we developed earlier this year, as well as maybe looking at the recorded webinar that supported that guidance. Other tips to consider, not necessarily compliance, but they're definitely good practice, is does your policy talk about working with partners? Does it talk about working with organisations with persons with disabilities, or OPDs or DPOs? Does it mention disability inclusion in your internal operations as well as your overseas programming? And do you include information on your website about disability inclusive approaches? So as I mentioned, these are not embedded as requirements in the code, but this is the kind of level that we're looking at strengthening our members, or these are the kind of comments that we would be suggesting going back to members to think about improvements in the future. They all explained and talked about in detail in that ACFID guidance and in that webinar, but we just wanted to bring them to your attention today. Another one of the documents required to be uploaded in your CSA is your PSEAH policy that commits your organisation to the prevention of sexual exploitation and abuse through a survivor-centred approach, as well as your revised complaints handling policy that also has PSEAH components. So far, of the 30 or so PSEAH policies that we have assessed, about 40% have required resubmission or have been asked to do a little bit more work to meet compliance. So some of the common reasons that we're seeing when we're looking at the PSEAH policies that are coming through are that the policy may not cover partners. That's a requirement in the code. The policy did not specify the agency's reporting responsibility when an incident has been identified, including processes for reporting to local enforcement authorities and subject to the wishes and welfare of the complainant or survivor. That's quite a strong point. It's got quite a lot of bits and pieces in that one sentence. And sometimes that is dealt with partially, but not fully in people's policies. And another thing that we're seeing is some policies and procedures were just not adequately survivor-centred in their approaches. Some of the characteristics we're seeing in terms of complaints handling policies are that the policy has not been revised to incorporate the new code requirements, that the policy might not talk about, or they might talk about serious incidents in their complaints handling policies, but they might not be accompanied by a corresponding triage process. The policy might not articulate the ability to de-identify complaints at the request of the complainant or survivor. And some policies are a bit light on in terms of documenting or outlining the investigation procedure. So these are all things that we are asking you to consider when reviewing your policies. One of the key takeaways is that we can see that some members are taking the time to blend their child protection and their PSEAH policies. So making an umbrella or a broader safeguarding policy designed to cover both adults and children and also meet code compliance commitments of 1.4 and 1.5. This has been done successfully by a few members, and it feels like that is a trend that might be that we might be seeing in the future. We have responded by uploading some of those good practice examples in the good practice toolkit, and I am also meaning overall safeguarding codes of conduct as well, designed to cover both 1.42 and 1.5. So before November rolls around and your due date for the CSA comes up, why not take the time to review what you have in place now? Look at the guidance that we've provided on both complaints handling, the PSEAH and the disability inclusive development. Check out the recorded webinars that support those guidance documents and look at good practice examples of how other members have done these successfully. The final focus area for this year is environmental sustainability. So far, we are seeing really high rates of compliance. This is not an area where we are assessing policies or procedures in detail. So we're not asking you to upload your policies in the portal. But we are relying on members clearly explaining what you have in place to address the verifiers for that commitment. So this includes having policies or guidance around how your organisation has minimised the environmental impact of your internal operations. It includes advice about how you've promoted environmental sustainability and improved environmental outcomes in your initiatives overseas. And also, we're keen to hear about approaches that you have that include an analysis of environmental risk and management. So those are some of the trends that we are seeing in terms of the focus areas and overall compliance. Another way that we consider compliance is in terms of complaints. So it's just another way that information comes to the CCC. So as you may be aware, the ACFID Code of Conduct Committee, or CCC, has an independent complaints handling mechanism which considers potential breaches of the code. In the last year, we've had 10 complaints. So I'd like to take a moment to emphasise this, that a significant portion of the complaints received have related to members' lack of responsiveness to the complainant. So in multiple cases, this is due to ACFID members not initially understanding or classifying an expression of dissatisfaction to be a complaint, and therefore not handling the complaint in accordance with their own complaints handling policy. So I think behind that is, I'm sure that members have the intention to do well and to handle the complaint well, but if it hasn't been classified or understood as a complaint, then it's often misdirected and handled differently. And invariably, most of those cases end up at the Code of Conduct Committee. So there is a good learning for this in everyone, and it boils down to good training with staff and volunteers, proper oversight of feedback coming to the agency, and a familiarity with your own definition of what a complaint constitutes and your own policy. So the best way to think about managing or responding to a complaint is by taking the lens of a complainant. Not so much a survivor-centred approach, but more like a complainant-centred approach or a people-centred approach in terms of how one would deal with a complainant. So that's the end of the overall snapshot of compliance for today. Hopefully there are some tips and lessons in there for you to consider when preparing your CSA. But for now, I'm going to get into chapter 2, which is about the nitty-gritty of code reporting. So before we dive in, let's just do a quick refresher on the principles of code reporting. So quickly, members are asked to self-assess compliance with the code every year and submit reporting every year. This includes annual report. This annual reporting always includes an annual report and audited financial statements, and either an exceptions report or a code self-assessment. Members are advised every June as to what their specific reporting requirements will be, a CSA or an exceptions report. Members complete a CSA every 3 years and an exceptions report for the 2 years in between. So just remembering that a CSA is more the crunchier, the harder, the heavier year of reporting, and the exceptions report is the lighter touch. The due date for the reporting will always be set at 5 months after your financial year ends, and the relevant online form will be open to your organisation months prior to this date. So hopefully a lot of you will have received an email yesterday just letting you know that your online form, your CSA or your exceptions report for those with a due date in November this year will mean that the form is available to you now to start manipulating and popping in content.
Hi, Amy. 你好.
So we'll go on to the 5 things now. 5 things to consider when preparing your second CSA. These are our 5 things. These are our top 5. Number 1, use your previous CSA as a base. So read your previous CSA and start from there. Assess whether any processes or policies have changed since you last prepared that reporting, and mention them if they are relevant. Some of you have answers that can probably go unchanged. In those situations, and if relevant, you could think about maybe updating your older example to a more newer example. So it'd be great to read in 2021 about an example potentially that happened or that supports your compliance that's recent and not something from 2016. There is a little trick in the compliance portal. If you go into the CSA, you'll notice a new little button that says copy and paste your previous answer into this commitment. So that's designed to make the whole job a little bit easier for you. So a common question from people is, can I use my responses from the previous CSA if nothing has changed? And our answer is, this is generally fine. If there have been no updates to your policies or procedures, if it isn't part of the PSEAH updates that landed in the code in 2019, there'd be no need to change your response. And if you weren't given any feedback or advice or resubmission on that point, and it sailed through as an adequate way of reporting, then there's no need to revamp the wheel. Number 2 is consider previous feedback. So in your previous CSA, there may have been some good practice suggestions or feedback that was offered in the assessment. So usually we try and structure our feedback to be either a helpful suggestion or something that helpful or something that actually needs to happen, i.e. resubmission. So hopefully we have been clear when we've given you feedback as to what we would suggest you think about and look at in the future and what we actually need action on right now. So consider if your organisation has acted on any of those suggestions, and if so, mention this, as it will strengthen your compliance. We're guessing there's a bit of pressure to achieve compliance from the perspective of a member, and most of us have, competing priorities. So given this, you may have been in a scenario where those good practice suggestions or those tips and tricks may have been lying dormant for some time. So this is the time to reconsider those suggestions now. So take the time to read them. And just as an aside, don't forget the good practice indicators. Whilst these are not part of your actual assessment and they're not considered code requirements, they can be helpful when you're looking at ways to strengthen your practice. And we hope that members will be doing this over the course of time. 3, address the PSEAH changes. So we'll touch on PSEAH changes a little bit later in the webinar, but they're essentially the new components in the code that landed in the code in 2019. And for most, they will be new since you've prepared your last CSA or your first CSA. So because of this, and because it's deemed a high risk area, we'll be looking specifically at your reporting to see if these have been addressed. Ultimately, we are looking for an assurance that you understand those requirements and what they mean. So hence, we encourage you to mention them specifically in your reporting, and understanding whether your organisation has the various approaches in place to meet compliance. So describe them. For example, we have now included safeguarding as a standing item on our board's agenda for each quarterly meeting. So state what you've got. If relevant, you could talk about what you have done to meet these requirements. So you could tell us briefly about the journey that you've made in order to strengthen your own approaches. You could briefly reference how you're implementing some of those practices or approaches with your partners or your activities. It doesn't have to be too detailed, but a couple of sentences will be useful. It may be that your organisation already has many of those elements in place prior to the code changes, and hence your answer will be super brief. However, it is expected that all members will have done this work. So these changes came into effect in 2019, and now there is the expectation that your organisation will have effectively engaged with those changes and strengthened your policies and approaches where necessary. Number 4, be prepared. So have your policies ready for uploading. The 3 that I mentioned before, being your disability inclusive in policy statement or guidance, being your PSEAH policy, and being your complaints handling policy. So make sure they're ready, and these will be assessed. Make sure that they are your most current and have been checked against the specific requirements in the code verifier. So we're less interested in policies from 2014. We're assuming that most policies should have been updated since then. Remember, the good practice toolkit is your best friend, or one of your best friends in code. It has all these layers of information, including guidance, good practice guidance, and resources section for your code commitments. In it, you'll find all the guidance that we just mentioned. You'll also find examples of good practice policies from other ACFID members. And always prepare your reporting offline and save elsewhere. It happens to everyone at some point, and it is particularly painful to lose your work. The portal does not have an auto save button or function, so you need to press the save button actively. So best to back yourself and prepare your reporting offline. You can just copy and paste it when it comes time to inputting. And tip number 5 is don't assume. So don't assume that we know your organisation well. You know it far better than we ever will. So paint the picture for us. We know the code well, and there's sometimes a bit of a dance in trying to apply every aspect of the code to your organisation. But this is where we can help, especially if you have painted a thorough picture and explained how you work. Don't assume that we assess all of your submitted policies and documentation. So rather, we focus solely on those policies specifically being called in. Sometimes there is the temptation to throw us all of your policies and manuals and templates and tools and let us figure out how and if your organisation is compliant. So this is not the way the process is structured. Essentially, the code relies on self-assessment. We do verify compliance of those policies being called in, but we don't verify policies generally beyond those particular focus areas. Don't assume that overall compliance. So don't assume you're compliant unless you've checked that you've met all the code requirements detailed in the verifiers. Cross-check. It will save you time in the long run. And ensure your commentary addresses all of the compliance indicators. Sometimes it's best to tease them out. So maybe allow a paragraph per compliance indicator. Maybe break them up into compliance indicators or use subtitles or the like. This is not essential, they're just tips that work well for many members. So, given those 5 top tips to get you going, we thought it might be helpful to have an example. In fact, a good example and perhaps a less than ideal example. So, taking, for example, 2.3.1, this is all about the code asking members to have a policy statement or guidance document that commits the member to promoting gender equality and equity and to non-discrimination in regard to gender identity. It also goes on to say in the verifier that the policy should address how these are prioritised within their own organisation, as well as in externally within the organisation programming overseas. So this example that we've given gives you, it does tell us what we need to know, and it gives us assurance that this organisation X is compliant with the code. So why is that? Number 1, where the code asks for a policy statement or guidance, such as in 2.3.1, this answer tells us that organisation X has one, which is confirmation of compliance. It also confirms this by titling the policy, as I've highlighted in yellow. The verifier asks that this policy needs to cover gender equality and equity, both within programming as well as internal operations. And this answer tells us that the policy does specifically both of those things, which is why I've highlighted that bit in grey just to show you. So from our perspective, this gives us assurance that the organisation has a policy and the policy addresses the verifier, that the person preparing the compliance report understands what's being asked for in the code, and the person preparing the report is familiar with the fact that this is one of the increased requirements that landed in the code in 2019. So it's part of the PSEAH changes. It also means it's likely that this answer is not a direct copy and paste from their first CSA. it's likely that organisation X has rejigged or adapted that answer to meet the current code requirements. So as an alternative answer, we'd like to share the bit in blue, which doesn't give us exactly the information that we need to know. So why is this? It's not specific enough. So it tells us that organisation Y is committed and identifies the issue at heart, but they're kind of words inside a CSA. Rather, we are looking at how the organisation demonstrates this through their own policies or their processes or guidance or statements outside the CSA reporting form. It's probable that organisation Y's policy approach is via the statement, which is why they've brought it up there in their program manual. And that is not specific enough to address 2.3.1 because it focuses solely on non-discrimination and it doesn't go far enough to addressing how the member promotes gender equality or equity. 2, it's also silent on the detail. So it's silent on the new code requirement for the policy to address how the commitment is prioritised within organisational programming and within the internal operations of the agency. So from our perspective, this gives us the impression that organisation Y doesn't have a policy that meets the requirements and that the person preparing the compliance report probably hasn't fully comprehended what the code requires. And they probably have overlooked the fact that this area came under the increased requirements resulting from the PSEAH work in 2019. So the result for organisation Y is that the code team will ask organisation Y to resubmit and prompt them for some more specifics. I'll give you one more example. So just going into the next level of 2.3. So another example is in 2.3.2, members are asked to have in place a design or planning framework, a tool, a template, or a systematic approach to ensure that those marginalised by gender are included in consultation, that a contextual analysis of barriers to their inclusion is undertaken, and opportunities for their participation are identified. So organisation X's response is clear and compliant. Why is this? Similarly, where the code asks for tool templates or the like, this answer tells us that organisation X has 3, which is a confirmation of compliance. So these are highlighted in yellow just so that you can see them, along with a title, which gives us extra comfort in our assessment processes. The answer confirms back to us what the code is asking for us in 2.3.2, which I've highlighted in grey. So from our perspective, this gives us the assurance that organisation X has ample tools to address the verify specifically, and that the person preparing the compliance report understands what is being asked for. This answer may very well be a direct copy and paste from a previous CSA text submitted by the organisation back in 2017. As an alternative answer, we'd like to share with you an answer that doesn't give us what we need, for the purposes of good contrast. So why would organisations Y's answer not be good enough? Well, one, it's not specific enough. It tells us that organisation Y recognises barriers that are an issue which needs to be overcome. Now, it does not step out what the organisation has in place to address this. It's also silent on the detail. So there are no mentions of tools or templates or approaches. And it also adds a broad brush statement that is not adequate for us to fully understand what that is. So gender is one of our cross-cutting themes. It could cover a whole range or could be a platform statement. I don't know. We need more visibility over what that means. So from our perspective, this gives us the impression that organisation Y doesn't have in place an embedded approach to consulting those marginalised by gender, nor potentially have appropriate methods to identify barriers and opportunities. And the result for organisation Y will be remedial action, as the code team will ask organisation Y to specifically confirm or deny and ask for more detail about how they actually are approaching 2.3.2. So that's probably enough examples for today, but I just wanted to try and put those tips into practice and give you a bit more of an oversight about what we're looking for in reporting, with the ultimate outcome being a reduced amount of resubmission items, which will alleviate that compliance burden. I might hand over now to my colleague, Paul.
Yeah, thanks, Soph, and certainly a big thank you for stepping in at the very last minute on a lot of that material. Yes, it was an exciting start to the webinar for us, in more ways than one. Yeah, look, we get plenty of questions from all of you, and we thought it'd be a good idea just to cover off some of those we get more frequently. Yeah, look, the first question is, where can I find information on the prevention of sexual exploitation and abuse? So the easiest place to find this information is in our Good Practice Toolkit, as Sophie mentioned. So go to our website at acfid.asn.au and then to the Code of Conduct tab in the top ribbon or menu. Then go to the Good Practice Toolkit, and then there's a PSEAH changes 2019 tile, and then the changes should be will be there, and they'll look something like you can see on the slide in front of you. Second question is, what documents do I need to upload into the code self-assessment? So we pretty much covered a lot of that beforehand, but just to recap, we're looking for a PSEAH policy or safeguarding policy at commitment 1.5 in the code self-assessment. And we're also looking for a disability inclusive development policy at commitment 2.4. As I've mentioned, please look at the verifiers and guidance in the Good Practice Toolkit to see what is required. While environmental sustainability is a focus area, just confirm that we're not seeking your policies in the code self-assessment. Really, our focus is on improving practice of members this time around, not so much on the compliance and policy side. However, extra points if you have an environmental sustainability policy or statement up on your website, as we will take that into account as of evidence of your compliance for that particular requirement. Next question. Have the code's financial reporting requirements changed this year? Short answer is no. The financial reporting requirements of the code have been stable since this version of the code came in from the 2017 year. However, we do see some, I suppose, they're not common issues, but some of the issues that do come up, and some of the more fatal ones that we see to getting your compliance from being compliant with the code. We do ask that you do ensure that you publish financial statements in the code compliant format in your annual reports, and that they include an auditor's report that refers to those financial statements. You can't just recycle the auditor's report from your full audited financial statements if they are different from the code compliant financial statements. In that case, they will need their own auditor's report. And that's so that we've got independent assurance of those, of both sets of financial statements, and that the readers of those statements can rely on them. Will you use financial ratios in your reporting, in your annual report? Please make sure you include notes to explain how they've been determined. That's a code requirement. It's one that not only just applies to use of financial ratios in the annual report, but also to where they're used on your website or in any other place. We also ask that when you're preparing your annual and financial reports, please take any account of any feedback that we've provided last time round. I think probably a trick is finding the feedback, which is not in the code self-assessment. It is in the compliance portal, but it is in the annual reporting and financial statements tile of the compliance portal. So yeah, please make sure you have a look at that for last year's reporting to see if there's any feedback. And yep, as mentioned, we'd like to see that reflected then in the current year. And last but not least, please make sure your annual report is put up on your website. Quite often that's a code requirement, and quite often we see annual reports not being up on the website. And I think with lockdowns and that sort of stuff, yeah, the frequency of that has increased as I suppose just the logistics between different people all working apart has meant some of those things have got missed. The next question is, where can I get help with ANCP? It's the DFAT Australian NGO Cooperation Program accreditation. We have, I suppose, spent probably a good part of the last year working on mapping the code against the ANCP accreditation criteria. We're just about to get that up on our website. Not quite there yet, but it should be up there soon. We can provide you with an advance copy of that if you need it earlier. Now, the purpose of that mapping is to, I suppose, clarify, help people understand where meeting the code requirements, how much that goes towards meeting the ANCP requirements. So there'll be some bits where there's sort of pretty much a full matching, some bits where there's a partial matching, and some bits where there's no matching at all, which would be probably the areas you need to focus on for the ANCP, to meet ANCP accreditation requirements. I should also point out too, we also ran a webinar on the mapping, I think last year or late last year, and that's available on our YouTube channel, which is on our website under our learning page. Next question is, how do I apply for an extension of time to submit my reporting to ACFID? You do that by emailing us at code@acfid.asn.au when it's apparent you will be late. Please include the reasons why you need longer and an indication of how long you think you need. Look, as a general rule, extensions of up to 3 months will be approved. Extensions for a longer period or multiple requests for extensions can stretch the friendship a little bit, and in some cases may require escalation to the Code of Conduct Compliance Subcommittee for decision. But yeah, rule is there. If you think you're going to be late, certainly get in touch with us as soon as you can, and generally we can sort things out. The next question we've got is, how do I change our compliance contact or CEO or chair in the compliance portal? And this one often comes up just when reporting is due, when people realise all the information in the portal's a little out of date. The short answer is you can't change any of those roles from your end. They are security roles in our system and can only be changed by us here at ACFID. So if you have changes, please email them to us at the code mailbox. Again, that's code@acfid.asn.au with details of who's leaving, who's new, and what their roles are. For people coming, for the new people, we also need to have their names and email addresses. And it's also handy for us to know if those who are leaving roles are no longer with your organisation, so we can get them off your portal records. I should also point out here that the compliance contact in each organisation can add users who have read and write access to the portal. So that's people who might go into the portal, who might be contributing to answering some of the questions in the code self-assessment, for instance. So the compliance contact can do that by going into the Manage Access tile in the compliance portal. And there they'll see a list of all the people who've got My ACFID access in the organisation. They'll be able to add those, add compliance portal access to those people as well. But how is, you know, as I said earlier, if it's a CEO, chair or compliance contact that needs to change, then they need to come back to us. So just bear with me a sec. Just going back, I just had a couple of questions come through from earlier. One is, what do code compliant financial statements look like and how are they different to standard financial statements? The code compliant financial statements are ones that are, I suppose, mandated by the code, and they really focus in on the organisation's international aid and development activities. And they basically set out a minimum level of disclosure for our members, particularly around the income statement. You can find the code compliance financial statements in the good practice toolkit. If you go to compliance indicator 3. Now I've got myself in trouble, 3.3.2. Sorry, I'll say that again, 8.3.2. I'll repeat that, 8.3.2 is the right one. There you'll see briefly what's required at the compliance indicator level. There'll be at the bottom of the page a resource section, and they've got some templates for the income statement that you can use. The main differences are around the income statement. When it comes down to balance sheets, we're quite happy for you to use a balance sheet that complies with the Australian accounting standards, which is the one that would be normally in your audited financial statements. The other requirement for some is statement changes of equity, and again, that's just probably what you'd normally do as well. But the income statement itself is a little bit different. Yep, so that's where to go to get that. If you've got any other questions or any doubts about that, send us an email at into the code inbox, and we can point you in the right direction. I've just got another question here about, is there a new requirement or changed language about reporting income expenditure for international political or religious adherence promotions programs expenditure? Not that I know of. That's not an area that has changed at all since I've been in ACFID. I think it's essentially just captures, I suppose, a level of non-development expenditure that's, I suppose, money that's spent overseas, but it's not spent on development activity. It's just spent on activity that's about perhaps supporting churches and religious activity or other non-development activity. Probably the main, I don't know if there's some confusion there, but there was a new category that came in with this version of the code, which is more around commercial activities, commercial expenditure and income. And that's for sort of activities where an organisation might undertake a commercial activity. It could be running a raffle, running a shop, and that's for the purpose of raising money that is then spent on international aid and development activity. And that's its own sort of newish category that we asked members to report on in their income statement. Righty, I might move right along to the next question, which was all about, actually, can you excuse me for a sec? Sorry about that. That was just needed there for a minute. So the next question I've got is, how will our CEO and chair be notified that the CSA is ready for their approval? Unfortunately, the compliance portal does not do that automatically. That's something that happens outside that system. So if you're the compliance contact, you will need to email, call, or however you contact your CEO or chair to tell them that the CSA or the exception report is sitting there waiting for their approval. Sort of along the same lines too, we do get asked, how does the CEO or chair know that once they've approved a code self-assessment or exceptions report, that has gone through to ACFID? Again, they don't get anything back from the system. It'll just go off. Probably the best way of checking that it has been received by ACFID is going into the compliance portal and into that first sort of screen of the portal, which is a bit like a dashboard, and the status of the report should say submitted, awaiting ACFID approval. If you see that, that means that it's over on our side and that we'll be able to see it. Next question is, where can I get more help on the code and other reporting? And I think Sophie again covered this quite well earlier. Really, for the code, the number one resource is a good practice toolkit. And as Sophie mentioned, that includes the compliance indicators and their verifiers and the guidance for each compliance indicator, and a whole bunch of resources such as examples, related guidance from other organisations, and other resources aimed to help you with your practice and to also respond in the code self-assessment. As mentioned before, for members going for ANCP accreditation or re-accreditation, a mapping of the code versus the ANC accreditation criteria should be a good resource to start with. And again, that should be up on the website very soon. Also, you can also point to the DFAT website, and they've got a bunch of resources up there, including the ACNC accreditation manual, which goes through their requirements in a bit of detail. Again, if you can't, having trouble finding any of that stuff, drop us an email and we can point you in the right direction. Similarly, when it comes to the Australian not-for-profits Charities Commission, there's some mapping there of their governance standards against the code. That's up on their website. So probably if you go to their website and search for ACFID code, it should come up with the mapping. That's a useful way of just ensuring that you're meeting the ACNC standards as well, or their governance standards. It's a useful check. Again, if you have trouble finding it, let us know.
Paul, I can one of the questions have just come through on the chat. I'm happy to answer that one if you like.
Yep, fire away.
So the question is, when submitting our CSA, should we still include an exceptions report if there are areas of non-compliance? So it's a really good question, and it is asked quite a bit. So before I actually answer it, I just wanted to explain that when the whole kind of compliance cycle and format was plotted out and designed, I suppose we thought about it as neatly chronological years, where a member would achieve compliance one year, a member would achieve compliance, subsequently. What we hadn't quite envisioned was the CSA process taking longer with sometimes multiple rounds of resubmission, which then means that the exceptions report that follows on from the CSA kind of crashes into it in terms of a timeline. So it is a byproduct, I suppose, of extended timelines and some resubmission work, where a member has a CSA resubmission due at the same time as the exceptions report for the following year. So that's, I think, just wanted to make sure that everyone understood what we're talking about. So in terms of what to put in that exceptions report when you've just done a CSA or currently in the resubmission phase, is we would like you to look through the areas of remedial work that you were asked to look at in your CSA, and where it was actually like a non-compliance issue and it followed on into that reporting year, we would like you to pop that into the exceptions report. Where the resubmission area was more like, sorry, could you explain further, or could you give us more information? We're just not quite clear. That's not necessarily non-compliance. That was just us needing more queries. And so that's an area that you probably wouldn't transfer into an exceptions report. But yeah, it's a bit tricky, but it's not, just do the best you can. And I suppose ultimately we feel comfortable with the fact that the CSA is really and the associated process of assessment is really the bit where a member works hard to achieve compliance. The exceptions report, the principle behind it really is just for us to be assured that a member is compliant, is aware that the code is in place, aware that they are obligated to be compliant with it, and to have done a self-review in some form for that year. But we don't actually assess the exceptions report officially as part of the, we don't get resubmissions on exceptions report in general. They're just, the purpose is something different outside the compliance cycle. A long-winded answer, and I apologise for that, but hopefully it gives you some kind of overview of what we're looking for. And if you're not clear from that, then please just send us an email at code@acfid.asn.au. I think they're the only questions that I can see on the chat box. Is anyone, it's 1:58, we've got 1 more minute. Does anyone have any burning, any thoughts or one last question for us today?
I can see a question there from Alan about following up on the religious, the international political or religious adherence promotion programs expenditure question, which I'll have to take on notice because I can't recall what the QAF update from May 2020 was. But I'll get back to you, Alan, on that one. No other questions at the moment. Okay. All right, well, look, thanks very much for attending, everybody, and I hope we've answered at least some of your questions. If you've missed something or think this is so good you'd love others to share in it, a link to the ACFID YouTube channel along with the PowerPoint presentation will be emailed to you, and all that stuff's ready to go. And before we say goodbye, we'd like to point out there's a quick survey that will be available in the chat box very shortly. There it is now. Yeah, please answer it. It won't take you long. It'll take you a minute or two. And it'd be great to get your feedback to help us make these sessions better in the future. Yep, once again, thank you very much. And we look forward to, I don't know, talking or interacting in some way, hopefully, in the not too distant future.
Yeah, thanks everyone. I'm going to go and attend to some U9 history, to some U7 Italian, and maybe some craft from my U2 student. So I wish you all the best in lockdown, and take care of yourselves.
Yeah. Bye, everybody.